What up, Wizards? It's Dev with a little news report for you. Did you guys know there was a world championship for Magic the Gathering this weekend? Yeah, a startling number of people did not know that, but there actually was. We had World Championship 30 on the same weekend they previewed, all these Foundations cards. So pretty good weekend in Magic here, unless you count the news about Universes Beyond being in Standard. I'm still not sure how I feel about it, but most people have formed their opinion on that, and it's a negative one, and I completely understand why, but I'm still taking my customary 72 hours to try and make sure I feel the way I actually feel. But anyway, that's a whole other video that we should do very soon. Right now, we're covering the top 8 of Worlds 30. And I want to go ahead and say congratulations to Javier Dominguez, really cementing himself as one of the best to ever play the game, because he is just the second two-time world champion in the history of our great sport. So again, if you want to call Javier Dominguez, J-Do, one of the best of all time, I think that I would probably agree at this point. But what deck broke off that number one spot? Dimir Demons. It's a deck that we haven't seen a ton of in the what we'll call preseason, all the challenges, MTGO League results, and other tournaments leading up to the World Championship. We would see versions of it from time to time, but it was certainly not one of the most popular decks in Standard, or really a deck that a lot of people were paying attention to at all moving into this tournament. We'll talk about that deck in full in just a second, but let's move through the rest of the top 8 here and just talk about what decks showed up to this event in the first place. Well, you had Seth Manfield show up with Golgari Ramp, which is not a traditional mid-range list for Golgari. Yeah, it's got I believe it's got the Glissas and stuff in it. It's got a lot of Golgari cards, but it's also got Overlord of the Hauntwoods and other sort of ramp specials in the deck. So it goes big on the top end. Kai Bud in this tournament, the Immaculate, one of the OGs in the game returning for this tournament. Kai Bud with Dimir midrange, a deck that we saw two almost identical versions of in the top 8. Dimir in general, just as a color combination, had 4 decks in this top 8. That is half the top 8. Very serious, but they're all somewhat different Dimir decks, apart from this Dimir midrange deck and Max Rappaport's Dimir midrange deck. They are very, very similar sort of piles with some differences, but for more or less, it's like the Dimir midrange or tempo deck that we're familiar with this season. Also, Ha-Fam was in here with Dimir Demons, but it's a different Dimir Demons list than Javier Dominguez, which I think is really interesting. It's a little bit more mid-range. It's a little bit more unstoppable slasher focused and stuff like that. It's a little bit more like the Mono Black and Golgari Demons list that we've seen all season. Javier Dominguez list is different, even though these are both labeled Dimir Demons. They're quite different lists. As a matter of fact, they played each other. Dominguez won that match. But Quintanoli, I hope I got that right, is playing Mono Red Aggro in this tournament, and one of the only 2 players in the top 8 to run a red-based aggro deck. This one is slightly different than the ones that we've seen a lot of this season. Yeah, it's got the small creatures, Heartfire Heroes and stuff, but it also has stuff like Screaming Nemesis in it. The 3-mana 3/3 haste from Duskmourn that whenever it's dealt damage, it deals the damage back. And if a player's hit by that, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. So slightly different, not so pump spell focused mono red list makes the top 8 here, along with a Gruul prowess list from, again, perennial pro player Yoshihiko Ikawa, who played very well, by the way, in this tournament. But Gruul prowess, I think, was a lot of people's aggro boogeyman, and they really sideboarded heavily against it. Gruul prowess was one of the most played decks in this format, or in this tournament period. So to only see one of those decks break through to the top 8, it's basically a guarantee that Ikawa played very well over the weekend. But still, this Gruul prowess deck was kind of one of the big boogeymen over the weekend. And you knew it was going to put 1 copy in the top 8 because of the sheer numbers it showed up in. But not to see more of it is a little bit surprising. But it is the Gruul prowess deck that we're mostly sort of familiar with. Things like, again, Heartfire Hero, but green spells like Snakeskin Veil and whatnot. So makes sense. And then Marcio Cavallo actually ended up going all the way to the finals with his Golgari midrange deck, a much more sort of focused and recognizable, familiar mid-range list over the season. That's kind of taken hold over the last 3 weeks, right? It's got the Glissas, it's got the Unholy Anesses, it's got the Archfiend of the Dross. Again, this is a list that's becoming more and more familiar by the day in best of 3 standards. So, there weren't a whole lot of surprises in terms of the decks that showed up in the top 8. And despite the, large number of Dimir lists, I still think this does show a fair amount of diversity, especially considering there were decks like Domain Ramp and 4-color Overlords and Mono White Control that showed up to the tournament but did not top 8 and could still, any given Sunday, take home a trophy, right? So I wouldn't necessarily discount the efficacy of those decks because they didn't top 8. I just think it adds to the story here, the illustration that Standard's probably in a good place in terms of, again, deck diversity right now. You've got 2 different Golgari decks that are actually fairly different in their philosophy and build. 4 Dimir decks, only 2 of which are even close to the same deck. 3 of those decks are very different, even though they play different color combinations. Apart from that, you've got 2 sort of different aggro decks. Again, they play different colors and different sort of late game schemes. If you get to the late game for an aggro deck, turn 3, you're doing different stuff in these 2 decks. So 2 sort of different aggro philosophies. So again, a pretty full and varied top 8 from what I can tell here. And again, even more decks that showed up to the tournament. Teamer Prowess was a big one that I think a lot of people are sad it didn't top 8 because a lot of people like that deck moving into this tournament. We're excited about it. But again, my point here is that there are a ton of different archetypes in this standard right now that I think you can win with, and that's a sign of health. But let's look at Javier Dominguez's winning list here. His Dimir Demons build. This is slightly different from some of the builds you might see. The builds with Doomsday Extractor or Excruciator kind of got lumped in with all the builds that just play, Archfiend of the Dross and stuff like that. So slightly, different, I guess, than you might expect it to look. But let's go into it here. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see all these cards. This is the list from MTGO Leagues and Challenges that plays the 2-of Jace the Perfected Mind along with a 2-of Doomsday Excruciator as kind of a win the game right now sort of combo. If you get Excruciator down, everyone goes to 6 cards, Jace mills them out. You have that in your back pocket most games. It kind of feels like the Vraska Innkeeper's Talent combo. If you can resolve the 1 card, you more or less win the game. So it's a late game way of securing a win that you're not looking for in every game. And Standard seems to have a lot of mid-range decks with a top end that just wins right now. Again, whether it's this or the Vraska decks or something, or the Doppelgang decks that we see in Standard right now. The Teamer Prowess deck is like that. If it gets to a certain level and gets to either Ultimate Ral or just cast enough spells in 1 turn, it just wins by going over the top with its engine. There's a lot of decks in Standard right now that are like that. Mid-range is poised pretty well. And in terms of this deck, leading up to this combo kill, it's got ways of winning the game with damage and threats while also playing the best removal and sort of tempo game in the format. So what we're actually seeing here is an amalgamation of the typical Dimir mid-range sort of tempo-y lists that play the Fairy Masterminds and the 2-mana counter magic and the go for the throats and the good removal and stuff. But it's kind of crossed with the Golgari or Mono Black Demons list. It takes advantage of the fact that Doomsday Excruciator is a demon, but it still plays the Archfiend of the Dross because that's a really difficult creature to actually deal with in Standard, and it's getting you extra damage as long as it's on the table and their guys are dying. Caustic Bronco is in this deck to help find stuff and just be like a Bob, a Dark Confidant, a 2-mana guy that draws you cards. Fairy Mastermind helps you play to your sort of tempo game plan a little bit. It's just a flash guy. It'll draw you some cards over the course of the game. That's always good too. As far as the sorceries, you'll note the 4 main deck Duress. We've talked a bit on the channel recently about how good Duress is in this format. And if you watch the MTG Rebellion do their State of Standard every week, shout out to them. They're very good. You should be watching them. They've talked a bit recently about how good Duress is in main decks in this environment right now. And we are all correct. Dang it. This card is great right now. Not only does it take, usually you look at Duress as an anti-control card. Not a whole lot of control decks in Standard right now, unless you want to count Mono White and the occasional Azorius list you come across. But in this format, this can mess with aggro because aggro decks not only play a ton of good removal that's good against us, we have creatures we want to play, right? But you get the removal out of their hand. But you can also get pump spells out of Mono Red's hand. You can get protection spells out of Gruul's hand and Blue-White Enchantment's hands, and that's pretty good. So it affects aggro decks pretty nicely in this format as well. It is main deckable. If you're up against a Doppelgang deck, takes out the Doppelgang, takes out the Invasion of Arcavios. If you're up against Golgari, it'll take out early game the Unholy Annex or whatever. Or again, their removal spells. If you're up against Mono White, it gets rid of their Caretaker's talent. They don't have a whole lot of ways of getting rid of that or getting it back, right? It takes out Planeswalkers like Liliana in the early game. It takes out their Reanimation spell against Reanimator decks. Just a million things Duress does right now, and I haven't even really broken the tip of the iceberg. If you learn nothing else from this video, learn that Duress is playset main deckable in Standard right now. It basically has work to do against every single deck in the format. Apart from that, another interesting inclusion here is the 3 of main deck Anoint with Affliction, along with a 4 of Go for the Throat, a 2 of Shoot the Sheriff, and just the 1 of Cut Down. Again, interesting here, in best of 1 Standard and even best of 3 all season. We're getting used to 3 and even 4 of Cut Down in the main deck, but Dominguez really leaned into 2 mana removal here because you just get a better, more reliable spell that way, right? You get Go for the Throat, which kills a bunch of stuff Cut Down doesn't kill. Shoot the Sheriff kills a bunch of stuff Cut Down doesn't kill, and takes advantage of the fact that people are cutting Slick Shot even from the Prowess decks to play, Picnic Ruiner and stuff like that. So this has even more targets than it once had, and one of the targets it didn't have was Slick Shot, and that kind of sucked. But again, this can pick up a lot of targets right now. So it makes sense to have 6, 7, 8, 9 2-mana removal spells in the main deck here, because when you think about it, 3 of these 2-mana removal spells are actually taking the slot of 3 cut downs, right? So in a way, it's like you're paying, the same amount of removal as you normally would, but a little bit more actually. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, 10 main deck removal spells is about right, isn't it? It's just the configuration of them that's really interesting. The 3 of main deck Anoint with Affliction is crazy because your opponent's never really going to get too many poison counters. So that means this is always just going to be exile a creature, mana value 3 or less. That's fine. Takes out the mono red creatures, takes out Gruul creatures, takes out oh my goodness, Deep Cavern Bats, and it very importantly takes out Haughty Djinns and Abhorrent Oculus, and they can't ever get them back. Exile is super important right now. This is going to exile Cacophony Scamps and Heartfire Heroes without them being able to hit you for damage equal to their power. So, man, again, really leaned into the main deck Anoints here in ways that other players didn't at the tournament, and I think it's really interesting. Also, 2 of Spell Stutter. What? Instead of Phantom Interference, we're going to play Spell Stutter. The only fairy in the deck is Fairy Mastermind, but that's fine, right? The upside on Phantom Interference is that sometimes it'll get you a 2/2 flyer, but really think about it. How often do you use that mode on Phantom Interference? It's not that often, right? So the ability to just play a mana leak, on turn 2, play my Mastermind. Now I've got mana leak up. Yeah, that seems really, really good. So I can see why that decision was made. The more important thing, the more kind of mind-blowing thing is just the 2 main deck counter spells. And that's all the counter magic in the main deck. So, the deck can play instant speed and go Fairy Mastermind if you don't do anything on 2. If you do something, they can counter it. Doo-doo, by the way. But if you do end up doing something, they can counter spell it, or they can just remove it in the early game. That's another thing. 10 main deck removal spells, most of which are more or less unconditional or light condition, removal spells. That means if they play a creature, let them resolve it. Who cares? I'm using the Spell Stutter on something that actually matters, and I won't just be able to remove. So that makes sense that you would play less counter spells when you have so much removal, and most of the targets that you would counter are going to be creatures anyway. So again, just really interesting choices here in his counter spell and his removal package. Usually you can't sit here and talk about the instants and sorceries in a Dimir deck for 5 minutes, but in this build you can, because it's just not a configuration you normally see. I really like the ideas on display here. But we also play 4, that was my keyboard by the way, we play 4 Unholy Annex in Ritual Chambers. So along with the Archfiend of the Dross and the Unholy Annex, we're again very much a sort of demons deck, and again, we can take advantage of the fact that its Cruciator is a demon anyway if we run this package. And I just kind of like the sort of mode of thinking here. But yeah, Annex draws us a card every turn. If we control a demon, we gain life, they lose life. If we don't control a demon, we lose life. Big deal, right? It's still a card drawn every single turn. So again, sort of the evolution of Standard over the last just 3 to 4 weeks has been breathtaking, because we started with all these Leyline decks, all these Gruul decks, and we were complaining about them. Some people were. And then we moved to mono white, which is sort of the mono red killer, because it gets all these removal spells. It gets all these cheap removal spells. It gets all this life gain. It gets Sunfall. It gets Caretaker's Talent and all this stuff. So it becomes like the default mid-range deck in the format. And once that opens up town for more mid-range decks to move in, because the playability of mono red has dropped off a good bit, the playability of Gruul has dropped off some, then we get to bring in all these mid-range decks, mono black demons, Golgari demons, and I again like that this is sort of combining a few different decks. It's combining Dimir mid-range in a way with the removal, the counter magic, the fairy masterminds, but it's also combining like mono black demons into the pot, right? With these unholy annexes, these archfiends of the draws, but it's also the Doomsday Excruciator Jace combo deck that shows up every now and again in like League and stuff. So it's like 3 different decks all thrown together that take advantage of the fact that, like, hold on a second. Okay, the Golgari deck is so good because black has amazing removal. Black has this really good like card draw piece right now. So why is green the color to play along with it? Glissa? Tear Asunder? Who cares? I'll pair blue and get access to really good flash creatures that draw me cards and fly. I'll get access to, counter magic in the main deck, and I don't really have to splash that many blue cards. To be honest, why aren't people playing this deck blue-black is the operative question, and it was answered this weekend. People should apparently be playing blue-black. Why did we add green to that deck? It's basically the idea, but I think it's just because Mosswood Dread Knight's so good. Golgari had been a great deck up until now, and I think it still is a great deck. But again, adding blue gives you so many options, not only in the main deck, but as we'll see, in the sideboard, right? If you go down here, sideboard has the 4th Anoint, 2 more copies of Cut Down when you do come up against aggro, which he may not have expected to do as much in this format. We've got Deadly Cover Up just to blow everything off the table. 2 Dreams of Steel and Oil, if you haven't seen this in a while. It's a single black mana, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose an artifact or creature card from it, then choose an artifact or creature card from their yard. Exile both the chosen cards. So you can get, this is a dumb example, but you can get like Valgavoth out of their hand and Rite of the Moth out of their graveyard, so they can't flash it back. But that's not going to happen too often. But there's plenty of stuff you want to do in their graveyard, obviously, but there's tons of creatures in this format too that you want to hit on turn 1 with Dreams of Steel and Oil. It's actually a solid card. Ghost Vacuum also messes around in yards. Gix's Command is good in like mid-range matchups and mirror matches and stuff like that. Also just good against aggro if you can rip to it. Jace the Perfected Mind for when you need to hit that combo hard. Liliana of the Veil for, again, like more mid-rangey and even control matchups. It's good. Negate, we see 2 of those because what's the point of playing blue if you're not going to play sideboard counterspells? 1 Outrageous Robbery. We've actually seen multiple people play this in their sideboard over the weekend in these long mid-rangey games. You know that your opponent's not playing any bad cards. So Robbery can be really good. And then a Withering Torment to take out enchantments because we don't have a whole lot of ways of doing it once they're on the table. Apart from that, there's 26 lands, 4 Restless Reefs, pretty good creature land, and then 2 Fountain Ports for, again, longer games and stuff like that. Everyone in this format should be playing, if you're not like hardline aggro, you should be playing some Fountain Ports. Which I was right about, by the way. So many people, when I put Fountain Port like so high up the list, were like, dude, Fountain Port looks terrible. What are you talking about? No deck's going to play that card. No control deck would ever play that. And it's like, nah, every deck plays Fountain Port because it's very good, but still. Unholy Annex, at some point in this format, usurped Caretaker's talent as like the best mid-range card draw engine, It was only a couple of weeks ago, so it's exciting to see it here take not only the World Championship, but put multiple decks into the top 8 of said World Championship. This is a very powerful card, not just because of the card draw, but the 6/6 Demon with Flying ain't bad either. So this all together, really, really cool stuff that we got to see from the World Championship, and it's especially neat to see a deck that wasn't really very represented, at the World Championship, and we haven't really seen too much of on Magic Online this season, but is, again, pretty familiar because it's just a Frankenstein of a bunch of different decks that are already powerful. Turns out you throw them all together, you got a soup. So congrats, Javier Dominguez. You definitely deserve it, but that's all I've got for this one, guys. Really exciting World Championship this time around. If you didn't see any of it, the VODs are available. I really recommend catching some of these games because it was a wild time in Vegas, man. But all things considered, great World Championship in what may be the last standard environment to feature a World Championship that doesn't have like Spider-Man characters in it. So cherish it is all I'm saying. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later. Do all the YouTube stuff on your way out. Just hit the button shaped like a thumb, sub to the sandwich for more content. It's preview season for Foul Nations right now. Don't you want to see that? Hit the button for the notifications. Anyway, check out the Patreon. Just $1 a month is all I really require from you. And I appreciate you if you consider doing it. But anyway, that's all I got, guys. I love you. I'm Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.